The White House is eyeing yet another tax cut for the wealthy, and they're actually being incredibly transparent about it. During a recent interview with Steven Mnuchin, we found out that there's a lot of focus on cutting taxes and possibly cutting government programs to save some money. Take a look.
Can you explain a little bit about what this plan is and how quickly you think you can move forward on it?
Sure. Well, let me first just put this in perspective, because there's no question that the president's economic agenda is working. The combination of tax cuts, regulatory relief, and now trade, getting the two big trade deals done last week. And the president has asked us to start working on what we call Tax 2.0. And that will be additional tax cuts that fuel the economy.
What will they look like?
Well, there'll be tax cuts for the middle class, and we'll be also looking at other incentives to stimulate economic growth.
Can you give us any hint as to what that is yet? Or still early?
I won't preview them here today, but again, they'll be focused on items that will increase economic growth.
So again, that is current Treasury Secretary and former predatory banker Steven Mnuchin. And he talks about how it's gonna be a middle-class tax cut, which was the same ridiculous lie that was told over and over again by the Trump administration in the lead up to the Trump-era tax cuts, version 1. And the truth of the matter is that's not really what happened. The tax cuts greatly benefited the wealthiest Americans, and it's been a disaster for a lot of people in the working class. So talk of election year tax cuts comes amid a swelling budget deficit that eclipsed $1 trillion for the 2019 calendar year. In addition, total government debt recently passed $23 trillion, despite President Donald Trump's promise that economic growth would wipe out the deficit and pull down the federal IOU. That did not actually happen. We all knew it wasn't gonna happen. We all knew that the talking points on the Trump era tax cuts were lies to begin with.
And that's why the Tea Party is so furious with Donald Trump. So they care about the deficit and the national debt, and how dare he lie about that and then blow up all of it. No, they don't care. They're not interested. It's not a Democratic president, so it don't matter.
They don't care.
Yeah,
they don't care, of course. Mnuchin maintained that the tax cuts would pay for themselves, even as growth has fallen well short of the administration's promises of 3% to 4% annually. He did concede that the level of spending needs to be curtailed. Economic growth has fallen below 3%, and the red ink has continued to grow. So how exactly would he cut some of the spending? Talks about it in the next clip.
This is all happening as the deficit looks like it's crossing some new high levels. How do you kind of look at that? When do you expect that deficit will be tackled, and how are we going to do that?
Well, that's a good question. And let me just step back for a second and comment on the first tax cuts, because I stand behind my comments that the tax cuts will pay for themselves, despite the New York Times disagreeing with me today. Let me just say, aside from tax cuts, we also did have increased government spending. And the reason for that was the president felt it was important to rebuild the military. It had been underinvested. So if you look at the increase in the deficit, a significant component of that is additional government spending. We did a bipartisan deal this year, but there's no question we need to slow down the rate of growth of government spending, because we can't sustain these deficits growing at these levels. We're following our projections, and we think it will pay for itself. Now, that's different than you can't spend the money on tax cuts and spend the money on increased government spending. So over time, we need to slow down the rate of growth of government spending.
So when he talks about government spending, what is he referring to? He's not talking about cutting back on the bloated military budget. He's not talking about cutting back on corporate welfare or government subsidies for research and development for some of these massive corporations. What he's talking about is entitlement cuts, government programs that we as middle class and working class Americans have paid into. So here he is, here's Donald Trump. You know, he has these moments of insane transparency that I actually really appreciate. And here's Donald Trump telling us that he would cut entitlements.
Entitlements ever be on your plate?
At some point they will be. We have tremendous growth. We're going to have tremendous growth this next year. It'll be toward the end of the year. The growth is going to be incredible. And at the right time, we will take a look at that. You know, that's actually the easiest of all things, if you look, because it's such a big percentage.
You're willing to do some of the things that you said you wouldn't do in the past, though, in terms of Medicare?
Well, we're going to look. We also have assets that we never had. I mean, we never had growth like this.
The growth is at the very top, okay? The middle class and working class continues to struggle. Wages continue to be stagnant. I'm gonna show you some facts and figures to back that up in just a minute. But John, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, look, GDP is a pretty horrible, antiquated way to measure economic growth. But even GDP growth, like quarter by quarter lately, has been like it was under Obama. What do you mean we've never had growth in this way? It's nothing compared to the 90s even. So that's nonsense. He tweeted today, I'm the only one who will protect Social Security. He just came off of an interview where he's like, oh yeah, no, not only are we gonna cut it, but it's the easiest thing to do, and why not? I don't rely on it. Rich people really don't rely on it. They get a similar amount that the poor do, but they don't need it because they have so much more money. And Mnuchin's talk there, I just love the way this pattern plays out. They say we're gonna pass these tax cuts, it's gonna pay for itself, and there's gonna be huge economic growth. We say that ain't true. Fast forward like 2 years, it didn't pay for itself, there wasn't economic growth, but they have a solution, cut spending.
Right.
So hand all the money to the rich and then try to balance it by getting rid of the government spending that actually benefits regular people. That talk, you're gonna hear no matter what. But if Trump loses, that is all you're gonna hear on the news going into a Sanders presidency is, after these wild years of rising deficits, now it's the responsibility of the Democratic president to cut government spending and balance the budget, and cut all these programs to help working Americans, and then the working Americans will hate them.
Right.
And then in 4 years, they'll elect another Republican because they'll be pissed off at the Democratic Party.
So the reason why there are so many attacks against Bernie Sanders is because he's not susceptible to caving in on those demands, right? Like he's not going to be pressured into cutting the programs that so many Americans rely on. These are popular programs like Social Security and Medicare. And so the leeches in the background who want to do anything and everything to destroy him are thinking about that. They're thinking about how these tax cuts and this gravy train will not continue under his watch. And that's why they hate him.
Well, and that's also why, look, let's say he wins, okay? But we don't do what we need to do all throughout these primaries and get the right Democrats to win congressional primaries, Senate primaries, and then win and enter the government. He can go into the White House and say, I'm not gonna be cutting these things. And then he could find himself with Republicans who wanna cut all these programs and enough Democrats that wanna cut those programs that any attempt to institute big new programs that might cost something, they'll be saying, economically, we just can't do it with all this deficit and everything. So we need President Sanders, but we also have to get the right legislators to work with President Sanders over the next 4 or 8 years.
I definitely agree with you on that. We need to focus on getting progressives elected, and that's why we do so many interviews with progressive candidates who in a lot of cases are trying to challenge Democratic incumbents. But at the same time, I also think it's important to not discount what Bernie is doing when it comes to empowering people. So look, he gets compared to Trump a lot, and there is one area where I see a similarity that I'm not even ashamed about, right? So why are so many of these Republican lawmakers willing to carry out what Trump wants, even though we know they don't agree with him, they don't even like him, they can't stand him? Because Trump is popular among Republican voters. And these lawmakers know that if they go up against Trump, right, these Republican lawmakers, then their political careers are over. Now, unfortunately, Trump is a nefarious figure. He is a disgusting, greedy, self-interested narcissist. And it's a devastating situation under his watch. But when a candidate like Bernie Sanders, and hopefully a president like Bernie Sanders, uses people power to actually accomplish a better society for the working class, then we have a model that's excellent, right? Yes, but that doesn't mean that I'm discounting the importance of getting progressives elected in Congress as well.
Yeah.
So I promised that I would talk a little bit about what happened in the aftermath of the Trump era tax cuts. So I'm just gonna go through this real quick so you understand where our commentary is coming from. This is reported by the Wall Street Journal, which is not some progressive news outlet. They published some information about what happened following these tax cuts. Savings went up 17% in 2018 from the previous year, according to figures from the Commerce Department. Economists say the recent rise is likely being driven by the wealthy. Mark Zandi, chief economist at Moody's Analytics, estimates that the wealthiest 10% of Americans accounted for more than 3/4 of the increase in their saving rate since the tax cut. Now, why do I bring you that figure? First of all, obviously it demonstrates that the people who benefited the most from the tax cuts were the super wealthy. But more importantly, it proves the point that they didn't take that money and invest it in creating jobs or making sure that wages go up. They didn't do any of that. They're like, oh, more money, okay. In a lot of cases with the corporate tax cuts, they bought shares of their own stocks, artificially inflating the values of their shares. And then in other cases, they're like, okay, well, let me go ahead and hoard more of this money. And that's what they're doing. That's what they're doing. That's why everything that keeps getting sold to the American people as a middle-class tax cut is complete and utter BS.
And my only follow-up question would be then, why didn't they? Why did they save it instead of just creating more jobs? And I think that the answer is important for people to understand. It's literally the most fundamental thing in economics. I did not get an economics degree. I did the minimal classes you need to do in it, but even I was schooled in this. It's because that's not how it works. You don't just have a bunch of money and then say, oh, then I guess I'll hire a bunch of people. You hire people to accomplish a goal that is driven by a need for more employees. A need that is driven by a demand for products and services, which is driven by spending. And if all the money went to the rich and they don't have anything to spend it on, they're not gonna magically create jobs that are unneeded because there's no new demand for the products or the services. And by the way, every single rich person understands that. Steve Mnuchin understands that. He doesn't think it's gonna stimulate economic growth and then, oh shucks, it didn't. He wants the money, that's all it is. And he knows that the worst case scenario for him is none of his promises for the tax cut actually come true, and he'll be asked a milquetoast question on CNBC at Davos, and then he'll go back to eating shrimp and drinking champagne. And that's it, there's no consequences for it. We go through this cycle like every 7 years in this country. There's always gonna be another big tax cut. It's never going to do what they promise it's gonna do, and nobody learns anything. We just keep repeating the same thing, and your favorite thing is, that's the definition of insanity I hear. But we keep doing
not my
it.
favorite thing.
I know, exactly. It's the exact opposite, but I keep saying it. Expecting a different outcome.
So does everyone else, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's really nothing else I can add to that. Just understand how they're lying to Americans right to our faces, pretending as though their actions are meant to benefit us, when in reality it's to benefit themselves.
Thanks for watching the Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.